Stephen Baldwin is getting candid about his exit from Hollywood. During an interview with People magazine published August 2nd, how his Christian faith played a large role in his departure from mainstream media.
They say nobody walks away from Hollywood when they're winning, but Stephen Baldwin did. Just when it looked like his career was about to reach a whole new level, he turned his back on the one dream almost every actor spends a lifetime chasing. The decision stunned the people closest to him, left Hollywood completely confused, and changed the course of his life forever. So what could possibly make a man walk away from everything he had worked so hard to build? This is the story of how Stephen Baldwin sabotaged his own legacy. The disappearance that shocked the industry before the world knew Stephen Baldwin as Hailey Bieber's father or as a man devoted to his Christian faith. He was one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars. At one point, he had everything Hollywood looks for. He had the looks, the confidence, the talent, and one of the most famous last names in the business. For a while, it genuinely looked like his career was heading in the same direction as stars like Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and many of the biggest leading men of that era. For a while, nothing suggested that his story would end any differently. However, that's not what happened. You see, instead of becoming an even bigger star, Stephen seemed to disappear. One minute, he was landing major movie roles, working alongside some of Hollywood's biggest names, and building the kind of career most actors spend their entire lives chasing. Then, almost without warning, the momentum came to a stop. His name slowly disappeared from the biggest movies, the biggest conversations, and before long, people inside and outside Hollywood were asking the same question. Whatever happened to Stephen Baldwin? Now, when an actor disappears, there's usually an explanation people can agree on. Maybe the movie offers slowly stop coming in, or a younger generation comes along and takes over. Sometimes it's even a public scandal that changes everything. Other times, personal struggles quietly begin to affect their careers until the work simply dries up. That's how most Hollywood stories play out, and after a while, audiences move on to the next big star. Surprisingly, Stephen Baldwin's story never seemed to fit that pattern. The more people tried to understand what had happened, the more confusing it became. Walking away wasn't what puzzled people. It was why he walked away. Before long, all kinds of theories started circulating. Some people believed Hollywood had quietly pushed him aside, while others were convinced he had made the wrong enemies behind closed doors. There were even those who thought his career had simply run its course, and that the industry had moved on without him. However, none of those theories came close to explaining what really happened. The truth was way more unsettling. This wasn't the story of an actor whose career slowly faded because Hollywood stopped calling. It was the story of a man who had already reached the point that millions of people dream about, and then made a decision to walk away. That's what shocked so many people then, and it's why his story still leaves people scratching their heads today. To understand what Stephen was walking away from, you have to look at how Hollywood operated in the late 1990s. Back in the late 1990s, this was the era of the mega movie star. Actors like Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, and Keanu Reeves weren't just making hit movies. They were becoming global brands. Studios weren't simply looking for talented actors anymore. They were looking for the next face who could carry blockbuster movies, sell tickets around the world, and stay at the top for years. And Stephen was quickly becoming one of the actors they believed could reach that level. He had the Baldwin name, the talent, the confidence, and the kind of screen presence that made people pay attention the moment he appeared on screen. As bigger offers started coming in, Hollywood wasn't just thinking about his next movie. Executives were looking much further ahead. They saw someone who could sign long-term movie deals, lead big-budget action movies, travel the world promoting them, and become one of the industry's next major stars. So, leaving that table wasn't just turning down a job. It was turning down an entire corporate empire. So, how does someone who seems to have everything decide to leave it all behind? The making of an A-lister long before fame, Stephen Andrew Baldwin was born in 1966 in Massapequa, a quiet town on Long Island, New York. He was the youngest son of Alexander Ray Baldwin Jr., a respected high school teacher and football coach, and Carol Newcomb Baldwin, who devoted her time to raising their 6 children. Stephen grew up in a busy household alongside his brothers, Alec, Daniel, and William, as well as his two sisters, Elizabeth and Jane. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary middle-class family. However, life inside the Baldwin home was anything but ordinary. You see, competition was almost a way of life in the Baldwin household. Whether the brothers were playing football in the backyard, arguing over who got control of the television, or trying to make each other laugh around the dinner table, nobody wanted to come in second. Their father believed in discipline, hard work, and pushing yourself to be better every single day. Looking back, it's easy to see how this environment shaped all four brothers. At the time, they were simply kids growing up together, with no idea that one day the Baldwin name would become one of the most famous families in Hollywood. As the older brothers began finding success in acting, Stephen naturally paid attention. Alec was the first to break through, and before long, Daniel and William were building careers of their own. Suddenly, the Baldwin name was everywhere. Movie studios knew it, television audiences knew it, and entertainment magazines couldn't seem to stop talking about the family. Of course, having famous brothers opened a few doors, but it also created a different kind of pressure. Everywhere Stephen went, people compared him to Alec or expected him to follow the same path. Instead of seeing him as Stephen, many people simply saw him as the youngest Baldwin. However, Stephen never seemed interested in becoming a copy of anyone else. While some actors chased polished leading man roles, he found himself drawn to characters who felt rough around the edges. He liked playing men who were unpredictable, sarcastic, and sometimes a little reckless because those roles gave him room to bring his own personality to the screen. Before long, casting directors started noticing that he had an energy that was completely different from his brothers. He wasn't trying to replace them. He was quietly building an identity of his own. He finally got his breakthrough role in the mid-1990s. Stephen was cast as Michael McManus in The Usual Suspects, a crime thriller that, at first, looked like just another regular movie. In fact, nobody could have predicted that it would become one of the most celebrated movies of the decade, or that it would introduce millions of people to a side of Stephen Baldwin they had never seen before. The movie wasn't just another crime thriller. It quickly became one of the most talked about movies of the year, earning widespread praise from critics and eventually winning 2 Academy Awards. Naturally, Hollywood took notice. The phone started ringing more often, scripts began arriving one after another, and Stephen suddenly found himself in a position every young actor hopes to reach. Over the next few years, Stephen showed Hollywood that he wasn't the kind of actor that can be boxed. One year, he had audiences laughing alongside Pauly Shore in Biodome, a movie that eventually became a cult favorite with fans. Then, instead of staying in comedy, he moved into more serious projects like One Tough Cop, proving he could handle dramatic roles just as well. Later, he introduced himself to a whole new audience when he played Barney Rubble in The Flintstones in Viva Rock Vegas. Of course, not every movie became a huge box office success, but that didn't really matter. What mattered was that Hollywood kept believing in him. Directors continued calling, producers kept offering him roles, and there was a growing feeling that Stephen Baldwin still had his biggest movies ahead of him. Now, if you were looking at Stephen from the outside, you probably would have thought he had it all figured out. His career was growing, Hollywood believed in him, and every sign suggested his biggest years were still ahead. However, success in Hollywood doesn't always tell you what's happening in someone's personal life. While Stephen was building his career, he was also beginning to wrestle with questions that had nothing to do with acting or fame. At the time, nobody outside his family knew it, but a series of unexpected events inside his own home was about to change the way he looked at success, his future, and even the purpose of his life. Before long, those moments would lead him to make a decision that almost nobody in Hollywood could understand. The prophecy Stephen Baldwin couldn't ignore. By the time Stephen Baldwin married Brazilian graphic designer Kenya Deodato in 1990, his life looked like it was falling perfectly into place. His career was taking off. Hollywood kept calling with bigger opportunities, and together they were building what looked like the perfect young family. However, something happened inside their home that still sounds almost impossible to believe, even today. It all started when Kenya hired a Brazilian housekeeper named Augusta. Now, Augusta wasn't famous, she wasn't past her, and she had no connection to the entertainment industry. She was simply a deeply religious woman who came into their home to do her job. However, after spending only a short time with the family, she told Kenya something that completely caught her off guard. According to Stephen himself, Augusta said God had shown her his future, and one day he would walk away from Hollywood, give up the career he had worked so hard to build, and dedicate his life to serving God. Naturally, when Kenya told Stephen what Augusta had said, he thought it was ridiculous. At that point, his career was moving in exactly the direction he had always hoped for. Bigger movie roles were coming in. More people in Hollywood knew his name, and it finally felt like years of hard work were paying off. Why would he throw all of that away? As far as Stephen was concerned, becoming a preacher or leaving Hollywood wasn't even worth thinking about. So he brushed the whole thing aside, made a few jokes about it, and carried on with his life, convinced that Augusta had simply gotten it wrong. Well, Stephen may have forgotten about it, but Kenya didn't. The more she talked with Augusta, the more interested she became in the faith that seemed to guide every part of her life. What started as ordinary conversations around the house slowly became something much deeper. Before long, Kenya was reading the Bible, praying regularly, and looking at life very differently from the way she had before. Stephen watched those changes happen right in front of him, but he wasn't worried, as most people would. He assumed it was simply a new interest that would eventually pass. However, weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. If anything, Kenya became even more committed to her faith. Suddenly, the couple who had once enjoyed the same fast-paced Hollywood lifestyle no longer seemed to be moving in the same direction. Stephen was still thinking about movie sets, auditions, and where his career could go next, while Kenya had started asking much bigger questions about life, purpose, and faith. At the time, Stephen couldn't understand why any of that mattered. As far as he was concerned, everything he had worked for was finally within reach. But something happened that forced him to stop thinking about his next movie and start thinking about his own life instead. The strange prophecy that came true on September 11th, 2001. America was shaken by one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in its history as the World Trade Center in New York was attacked. Like millions of people around the world, Stephen watched the heartbreaking events unfold on television. However, for him, it felt even more personal because he had grown up on Long Island, just outside New York City. Seeing people lose their lives so suddenly was a powerful reminder of how quickly everything could change. Almost overnight, the things that had always seemed so important began to look different. For years, Stephen had been focused on building his career, landing bigger roles, and chasing the next opportunity. But after what happened, he found himself asking questions he had never seriously asked before. If life could change in a single day, what really mattered? Was success enough? Was he spending his life chasing the right things? At the same time, he couldn't ignore what had been happening inside his own home. He had watched Kenya become more peaceful, more grounded, and more committed to her faith. Months earlier, he had laughed at Augusta's prediction, but now those words didn't seem quite so easy to dismiss. For the first time, Stephen began wondering if there was more to life than the career he had spent years trying to build. This was the moment Stephen stopped dismissing faith and decided to explore it for himself. He started reading the Bible, praying with Kenya, and attending church, not because someone forced him to, but because he genuinely wanted answers to the questions he had been wrestling with. According to Stephen, the more he searched, the more convinced he became that God had been drawing him in long before he realized it. Eventually, he decided to give his life to Christ, and from that moment on, his priorities changed completely. The skateboarding ministry that left Hollywood speechless after giving his life to Christ. Stephen Baldwin didn't try to keep his faith separate from his career. In fact, the opposite happened. The more his faith grew, the more it influenced the decisions he made. He became much more selective about the roles he accepted, started speaking openly about his beliefs in interviews, and gradually began moving away from the kind of Hollywood lifestyle he had once embraced. At first, many people inside the industry assumed it was just a phase. They figured he would eventually settle down and return to making the same kinds of movies that had put him on the map. But Stephen had already made up his mind, and he wasn't interested in turning back. Not long after, a trip to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, gave him an idea that would completely change the next chapter of his life. While he was there, he came across a youth ministry using skateboarding and extreme sports to connect with teenagers. Now, This probably sounded like an unusual mix, but the more Stephen watched, the more it made sense. The teenagers weren't showing up because someone had invited them to church. They were showing up because they loved skateboarding, and once they arrived, they were willing to have honest conversations about life, faith, and the struggles they were facing. Stephen immediately saw something Hollywood had never taught him. Sometimes, if you want people to hear your message, you first have to meet them where they are. Instead of simply admiring the idea, Stephen decided to build on it himself. In 2004, he used his own money, his experience as a filmmaker, and the connections he had built in Hollywood to produce an action sports documentary called Livin' It. Rather than making a traditional Christian film, he combined professional skateboarding and BMX riding with real conversations about faith, purpose, and everyday life. He even brought in respected athletes, including legendary skateboarder Christian Hosoi, because he wanted teenagers to see people they already admired talking honestly about their personal journeys, instead of feeling like they were being preached to. The response caught almost everyone by surprise. Within just a few months, more than 100,000 copies of Livin' It had been distributed across the United States. Before long, churches, youth groups, schools, and community organizations were requesting copies because they realized the movie was reaching teenagers in a way traditional church programs often couldn't. Instead of asking young people to come to church first, Livin' It met them where they already were, using bicycle motocross riding, skateboarding, and honest conversations about life to open the door to something much deeper. Before long, reporters who once interviewed Stephen about new movies and Hollywood premieres were now asking him about skate parks, youth outreach, and the ministry he was building. The change was glaring. The actor who had once been making headlines for his movie career was now making headlines for something completely different, leaving many people wondering how one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars had ended up on such an unexpected path. However, Stephen wasn't content with simply releasing a documentary and hoping people would watch it. He wanted to meet the young people it was meant to inspire. So instead of flying to movie premieres or spending his weekends at Hollywood events, he packed his bags, climbed onto a tour bus, and hit the road with a team of professional skateboarders, bicycle motocross riders, and volunteers. Over the next few years, they traveled to more than 125 cities across the United States. Some days, they were setting up ramps in church parking lots. Other days, they were inside school gymnasiums or community parks, wherever young people were willing to show up. The format was simple. The athletes would perform skateboarding and BMX demonstrations. The crowd would gather, and afterward they would have honest conversations about life, faith, and the challenges many teenagers were facing. Stephen wasn't standing off to the side as a celebrity guest either. He was fully involved. He helped organize events, greeted families, spoke with teenagers after the shows, and spent hours talking to people one-on-one. To many people, it looked like he had walked away from success. But from Stephen's point of view, he had finally found something that gave him a deeper sense of purpose than any movie ever had. Of course, back in Hollywood, people couldn't understand what was happening. Agents continued sending scripts. Producers kept calling with new projects, convinced he would eventually return once this phase was over. Every time an opportunity came along, they expected him to say yes. Instead, Stephen kept choosing the ministry, and with every decision, the distance between him and Hollywood grew even wider. The truth was, Stephen wasn't turning down movies because he had stopped loving acting. He was turning them down because his priorities had completely changed. After everything he had experienced, fame was no longer at the top of the list. He had already seen what life inside the Hollywood machine looked like, and for the first time, he wasn't sure it was a life he wanted anymore. The price of walking away from Hollywood sounds like the kind of brave decision people admire years later. But living with that decision is a completely different story. Once Stephen Baldwin stopped chasing the career everyone thought he was born to have, life didn't suddenly become easier. In fact, the years that followed would test his faith, his finances, and even the choices he had worked so hard to make. Yes, leaving the movie business gave him the freedom he had been looking for, but it didn't spare him from real-life struggles. For a while, Stephen stayed busy doing exactly what he believed he was called to do. He